A little closer. There we go. It's an honor and pleasure to be here. Thank you. I'm Brendan.
And I'm Daniel.
We're going to be tag teaming this today and telling you a little bit about our project. We're in the middle of it right now. It's called PlazaPOPS. I'm just going to read our tagline because it's, by way of introduction, a good summary, I hope. So PlazaPOPS is or seeks to be a high-impact, low-cost, and replicable demonstration of the potential of pop-up community gathering places within the privately owned public spaces, also POPs, of Toronto's emblematic inner suburban strip mall plazas. And what we're calling today's talk is supporting strip mall retail with social infrastructure. So we're going to take you through what we mean by context is sort of the broad drivers and forces that are sort of at play that set the stage for our project. We're going to take you through an overview of the project and our process, and then we're going to conclude with some of the goals for the project, many of which were sort of laid out at the outset, and a lot of them have also sort of emerged and been refined through the process we've been going through. So part of this initial context, we've talked a lot about this today. Is it really fluctuating as I go in and out? No, it's okay. Okay, sorry. We've been talking a lot about, obviously, the growth pressures that the city and the region are under. We're all no stranger to this. A lot of this is market-driven. It's also part of what we're actually planning for. We know the region is intended to grow by another 5.5 million people in the next 25 years or so, less than that. So very substantial growth. There's a whole framework from a planning perspective of how this is meant to happen. At the City of Toronto scale, one of the forces that we're most interested in, I guess, with our project is the avenues. And we talked earlier, I think Tamara showed a diagram earlier about the avenue strategy and some of the character areas that are within it and how we're thinking about these. We're working on a site that's highlighted here, the Wexford Heights Plaza, which is along Lawrence, is one of these avenues.
So yeah, I think it's been recognized throughout the day, the vitality of Toronto's inner suburban strip malls, where those small businesses are thriving and that diversity exists in full force. But with the Avenues plan, what you're seeing is, you can advance. I'll do it. You're seeing a lot of the strip malls are going to be demolished because they're taking up the space of these mid-rises. Part of the plan is that they'll be replaced by mid-rises with retail at grade, but here on Victoria Park, just south of Lawrence, it's a townhouse with no retail. So no retail is replacing a formerly vibrant strip mall. And this is from 2012. Orly Linovsky looked at strip malls, and this was an older city plan, but I think these dynamics are still at play, that official city policies kind of equate strip malls with the same value as a vacant lot, and we need to pay more attention to those social and economic benefits of strip malls in their redevelopment. And another example I think of often is along Shepherd Avenue, east and west. A lot of those strip malls are being replaced, and you get a lot of those dental offices and kind of office uses which bring people but not as much vitality, and those new retail spaces are totally unaffordable for the businesses that they're replacing.
So another bit of the context, and we've touched on this earlier today, that's our friend Macklin Hancock, who designed Don Mills in the early 50s. We're working in the inner suburbs with this project, so the parts of the city that were built starting after World War II. We know that these are very auto-centric parts of the city. It's also a landscape of single-use zoning and the separation of uses. This is a snapshot of the Wexford Heights Plaza where we're working. This image, I think, based on some of the cars, is probably like a late 70s, maybe early 80s photo, but this is a plaza that was built in the early 50s. It's one of the very early ones. We'll talk more about its form later.
So yeah, this is a study done by Jane Farrow and Paul Hess in 2011 about walkability in the inner suburbs, specifically looking at places where there are tower neighborhoods, and they found that there's declining car usage and more reliability on walking and transit, and that's something you can experience firsthand if you wander around these parts of the city. But 56% of respondents didn't have a driver's license, and many people have no car or are sharing one car amongst many adults. But as we explored, these parts of the city were built for the scale of the car, and there's kind of a lack of recognition of the humans that are inhabiting this landscape. So there's a deficit in the design of the landscape. And here is our site. It's a view of Wexford Plaza looking east from Warden, and there's no furniture, and people, any time of day you go, people are sitting on that sign waiting for the bus, and it's the intersection of two really busy bus lines, the 68 and 54 East, and there's just like a lack of recognition, a lack of dignity. There's no shade and nowhere to sit. And on top of that, you have challenging walkability. Lawrence Avenue is 7 lanes wide, including the turning lane. There's no mid-block crossing. You feel very vulnerable when you're walking around here. And the greatest consequence of that is the concentration of fatalities, pedestrian deaths in Scarborough, in the inner suburbs. It's a problem citywide, but the lack of infrastructure exacerbates that in this part of the city. And back to that study by Farrow and Hess, they looked at values, and many people, especially youth and seniors, said they felt safer with people around. They wanted places on their paths to sit, rest, and socialize. So there's a desire for a public realm that is inviting the social life that already exists there.
So building on that point, I mean, there's a very vibrant public life and a lot of culture that happens in these parts of the city. I think we all recognize that. It's been talked about already earlier. A lot of the sort of mom and pop retail and local entrepreneurialism and service-based business defines these parts of the city. In this image, this is just west of our site. We're seeing Gadir Meat and Restaurant, which is actually a series of businesses that have taken over almost all of one of these strip malls, and you're seeing some of that public life sort of spill out onto the sidewalk adjacent and through the day and through the night. This public life and the value of the public life that happens here and its relationship to the small businesses in these communities is something that's fairly well understood, very well understood locally, and I think it's also fairly well understood across the city in sort of urban-minded communities, certainly. There's been a lot of recent publication celebrating the public life that happens in these places and its value. And so that's something we're very interested in this project.
And the Discourse is a super local Scarborough-based media outlet, and I highly recommend checking it out on the socials.
Another aspect of our project is that we're also working in a part of the city with a lot of new Canadians. And going back to Julian and thinking about the way cultural landscapes work and the way different communities overlap and the complexity and interest that happens with that layering, that's very much where we're working. There's also a lot of sort of research that has looked at this as a phenomenon in other parts of North America and other parts of the world. So this book, Transcultural Cities, edited by Jeffrey Howe from 2013, one of the questions that is framed in this book is questions like, how can urban places function as vehicles for cross-cultural learning and understanding? We're very interested in that as an aspect of our project as well. So just to quickly take you through the sort of anatomy of a strip mall. This is, I mean, it's very similar to the main streets that we've been talking about, the streetcar suburbs. Just think about them as the same sort of grain, but set back about 18 meters or less. It depends on whether there's a double-loaded bay of parking. This one is one of those. So this strip mall is at Victoria Park in Lawrence, west of our site. So there's the strip mall. This is the part that the city controls. That's the city right-of-way, which is not as much, it's actually a huge swath, but in terms of the pedestrian environment, not very much of it. You have different conditions when you look at these closely. This is a highly fragmented example where you wouldn't read this if you were on foot looking at things, but there's actually a series of property lines, that same kind of granularity that we talked about earlier, which might actually be an interesting tool for protecting or changing at least the viability of redevelopment here. From the perspective of our project, whether or not we had one owner or 16 has proved to be a challenge to do what we're trying to do. But one of the points here is that we're interested in the privately owned public space, the space between the frontage of the building and the city right-of-way, essentially, and what can happen in that space, which is already functioning and perceived as part of the public realm, but it doesn't really have the amenities that you find in other parts of the city.
So yeah, so we have this equation, which is our project is responding to. So there's kind of this inevitable intensification that's coming to this part of the city. There's a desire for pedestrian amenities, and there's a limited strip of publicly owned land. So our question is, how do we bring social infrastructure to Toronto strip malls while supporting their current uses? So this is our answer, or we're trying it. I'll just talk about our project partners. It was funded by the Park People's Public Space Incubator, and it's also supported by the BIA, the city's BIA office, through their Kickstarter grant, and it's a project through the University of Guelph, and Brendan will talk about how it's integrated with Community Design Studio. So here's a bit of a more specific project overview. So POPS, you may be familiar with. It's a program within the city. This is their nice logo of a tree. And it's mostly associated with downtown. So you can see there's a cluster downtown. There's a few in the inner suburbs. But it's basically the city engages with a developer. They provide some kind of public amenity that is publicly accessible but is still owned by the landowner in exchange for maybe a few more stories. So our project is trying to recognize kind of the POPs in the waiting, which are the strip mall parking lots. Strip mall parking lots, if you ever walk around these parts of town, you cut through them as shortcuts. If the properties are divided, you don't really care who owns what. You park your car wherever. And here, this is in our strip mall that we're working in. It's Maysoon Kasim. She owns a clothing store in the Wexford Plaza. And last year, she hosted a community iftar in the parking lot. So there's a recognition that this is a public good despite it being privately owned. So we're being pragmatic in recognizing this as a spot for an intervention. So we are working with the Wexford Heights BIA. They're our main project partner. And just a little aside, you can see the BIA model tends to work better in this old city of Toronto, and there's only 4 BIAs in Scarborough, so that suggests a lot of questions about capacity, and hopefully somebody will take that on as a project, building capacity in the inner suburbs for BIAs. But the Wexford Heights BIA demonstrates a lot of capacity. This summer will be their 16th year of Taste of Lawrence, closing all 7 lanes of Lawrence between Warden and Birchmount for a street festival. If you don't like the Taste of Danforth because it's too crowded and you don't like lining up for things, this is good because you have all those strip mall parking lots to absorb the extra people. But when you go there, you see people are hanging out in the parking lots. It suggests that question, what else could a strip mall parking lot be used for? It is a public resource that is used in this weekend of the summer.
This is another interesting book that has been driving some of our work, Small Business in the City, by Rafael Gomez, Andrei Isakov, and Matt Szymanski. This is a quote from our local ward councillor for our project, Councillor Michael Thompson. There is little question that a major part of the enduring vibrancy of Canada's major urban centres lies in the dynamism of its small firms. I think that message has come through today pretty dramatically through all of the panels. This book in particular is interesting because it talks about the history of the BIA model, but really celebrates the role that we've heard about from others today that small business and entrepreneurialism plays in the social life and culture of our cities.
And I'll add that this project really depends on the capacity that Wexford has built in the neighborhood, that's a network that is about people knowing each other and working together. So we need them for this project.
And then really quickly, part of the thinking behind our project is we're working sort of in the rubric of pop-up tactical urbanism, probably a term that most of you might be familiar with, something that started in the early 2000s and really picked up steam after the world financial collapse in 2009. What you're seeing here is a parklet, an example of a sort of temporary test. Could be a permanent public space in a parallel parking. It's an angle parking. It's often in a parallel parking space in the public realm. We're trying to play with this idea, but in, as we mentioned earlier, a privately owned parking lot. And also one of the big benefits of tactical urbanism is that it's a lot more cost effective, and it's an opportunity to sort of test ideas and measure their performance before committing to something long-term and permanent.
So this is our site. It's on the northeast corner of Lawrence and Warden. Wexford Restaurant is there, which is a pretty iconic restaurant. It's like a piece of 1960s Scarborough that is still there, and they make very good orange juice. And Tony Kiriakou is the owner and has been he's very experimental. He puts up tents that sell textiles. He puts a beer garden in his strip mall parking lot, and he let that iftar happen last year, and so he's been a great project partner for this. So I'll just jump into our process, which is integral to this whole project. So this whole project, the foundation of it, along with our partnership with the BIA, is our community working group. And the community working group is made up of local residents, people engaged in community building in Scarborough and the local area in Wexford. It includes cultural center called Shwasti, the Arab Canadian Center of Toronto, Scarborough Center for Healthy Communities, a lot of friends of parks. And assembling this working group was really easy because as soon as the idea was pitched, they're like, we want this. we've been thinking about this, let's do this. So the project rests on, they're kind of creating the DNA of the project, and we're facilitating and connecting the dots between resources and their visions.
So Daniel mentioned that a big part of our process is also involving the University of Guelph through a community design studio. So we've got 18 or so Masters of Landscape Architecture students that we've been working with and bringing them through a process with the working group, a series of workshops and open houses and design development that's happening between Guelph and Scarborough. Our first meeting, that was the image you just saw, was about program development. These are just some quick images showing what our process looked like, us trying to synthesize these ideas into a program for the project with principles, goals, objectives, and how we would ultimately measure success. The second workshop was to develop an idea about themes that might drive the project. This came through discussion and workshopping with our working group. And then the students took those themes and were assigned a theme to develop a concept around. This is us working in studio. And then this is the students presenting those concepts to the community group and getting another round of feedback. Then that was reviewed by a panel that involved, again, some of the working group members. I'll just quickly go through these 6 images that show the different concepts that were developed, which are at the back of the room, and we'd invite people to have a look at. I guess the point about all of them is that there's a lot of common language in all of them in terms of we're trying to create a public gathering space. They're all obeying, we think, the program that we established, but they've all got a sort of different conceptual basis.
Yeah, and in an effort to kind of bring these concepts out to the wider world, one of the goals of the project was to put Wexford on the map, and this is an opportunity to envision what else a strip mall parking lot could be used for. And we invite you to check out PlazaPOPS.ca, and if you don't remember that, I have some postcards I can give you after. And there are the 6 concepts. You can get deep into them. There's plans, there's materials, there's plantings, and at the bottom there is a little form that you can fill out to leave your feedback. So just quickly, we are weaving this into economic impact assessment. Business people like numbers to prove that things are good for business, so we're trying to bridge the gap between city building and small business people's goals. And we'll also be doing a public life study inspired by Jan Gale and facilitated by Park People. So just to finish this off, we'll end with some goals. So
I also just wanted to add, just from a timeline perspective, we'll be building this thing and it should be opening for early July of this year. The idea is to time it for the opening of Taste of Lawrence. So we've got a lot to do between now and then.
Yeah. So we want to create a pop-up community gathering space that supports the public life of the neighborhood with social infrastructure.
Celebrates the cultural value of mom and pop retail.
Demonstrates a model for strip mall urbanization that supports existing small businesses in the context of change.
Strengthens local capacity through the design process.
Expresses the visions, hopes, and dreams of the local community.
Develops a replicable model for PlazaPOPS and other inner suburban BIAs.
And why don't you do this one?
Okay, this one relates to me. Develops a sustainable model for a yearly community-engaged MLA studio, Masters of Landscape Architecture studio. A big part of this is also building capacity in the training of the next generation of practitioners who do this kind of work, hopefully.
So thank you so much. Check us out on Twitter and Instagram, and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you.